Welcome, everyone. Today we're talking about cognitive dissonance. You might have heard this term before, and we're going to give you a little background and clarification with regard to how it works. To best understand cognitive dissonance, you need to know this guy whose name is Festinger. All right. So back in the 1950s, Festinger wrote this book called "When Prophecy Fails," and what he found while in the process of writing this book is he found and got in contact with this cult. And this was a doomsday end of the world cult. It was led by Dorothy Martin, and he started to follow this cult around. They said that the world was going to end on December 24th, 1954. And so he got in contact with them a couple years beforehand and just started to follow these individuals, interview them, etc. What he noticed about this cult is that when people joined it, they were quitting their jobs. They gave the cult all of their money. They left their family, etc. It finally gets to December 24th, 1954. They go to this place to sort of watch the end of the world and watch the end of the world. The world doesn't end. And then Festinger gets really interested in what are these individuals going to do now that they have spent all of their time, energy, money. They've left all of their former connections, and they've sort of and what they believed was going to happen didn't happen. He sits there and says, "Okay, what's going to happen?" So he gets this question of like, what did the followers do? Or that's what's interesting to us. Now, a rational person who's at a distance would say, well, the prophecy didn't come true, and so someone would say new evidence has come up, so I'm going to change my mind, and I'm going to leave the cult. And that's not what Festinger's found in all instances. All right, so this is where we get to cognitive dissonance. What he found is that there was a lot of individuals who would dig their heels in. So after the world doesn't end December 24th, 1954, some of the individuals were like, well, this is like the lower 48 California time. Maybe it has to be Hawaii time, right? Maybe we have to wait till midnight until, Hawaii as opposed to, midnight in California. A few more hours pass and they say, well, let's go back to our holy books or whatever it is we're reading. Did we get the date wrong? Was it actually December 25th? Was there a leap year involved? Let's go back and maybe we got the year wrong, right? So people continue to try to justify their beliefs when those beliefs are failing. And the reason for this, from a distance, it seems obvious, but these are things that we all do on our own lives, probably to a less extreme version. And the reason for this is that, these individuals had given away their entire livelihood. They quit their jobs, they gave all their money to this cult, and they left their family. So now they're in the process of trying to justify their behavior over the past several years. So, and we all do this to some extent. So if you think about an academic, right? Someone who's an academic for 20 years who gets really, really involved in perpetuating a certain theory or certain results that they're really excited about. When they're 50 years old and they're 20 years into an academic career, and someone shows them new evidence that their theories that they have been pursuing are inaccurate, academics don't just say, oh, thanks for the new information, I'm going to change my mind. Most academics start digging their heels in, right? Academics resist change just like the rest of us, all right? They dig their heels in and say, hold on, you're wrong, you forgot to carry the one, there's all this tangential information that you forgot to include. When academics start talking about, well, that's just an exception, right? Your example is just an exception. That's not the rule. You start getting a little bit worried about, okay, when academics start looking for start sort of like laying out all the little loopholes in their theories, and try to navigate in these weird ways, something's up. And again, the reason is because it's not just about when I am shown that I am wrong. It's not just about me saying, okay, you know what, I was wrong, let's move on. It's also a recognition internally, holy crap, did I just waste my entire academic career publishing stuff that is nonsense, right? If I have a publication record of 20 journal articles in 20 years, I sit there and say, how much time, energy, money, effort went into writing these articles that are all bogus now, that don't matter? Did I teach my students this stuff? The thousands of students in my classroom that I have I taught them the wrong thing? So people start to feel like they wasted their entire life on stuff that's not true. So instead of just saying I was wrong, it's not just I was wrong, but it's I was wrong, and now I have to reconcile the fact that I quit my job, gave all my money to an illegitimate cause, and I left my family. I cut it off my connections. Um, you can think about this when people start to question their faith later in life, right? So if you grew up Catholic your entire life, all of a sudden you get to the age of 60 years old and maybe you don't, believe in Catholicism anymore. Maybe you're, full-blown atheist. Most people don't just like up and leave the church. They don't just sit there one day in church and they're like, yeah, I just don't think I agree with this. Because there's also this internal thing going on, someone saying, oh my gosh, I went to Catholic school, I went to a Catholic college. Every week I've been giving 10% of my paycheck to this church that I don't even think should exist now. Maybe you just sent your kids to K through 12 Catholic school and you're like, oh no, did I screw up my family by sending my kids to something that I don't believe in anymore? So there's a lot of other baggage that goes on with regard to just sort of giving up one's beliefs and just simply admitting that you're wrong. So this is why people tend to dig their heels in. This is why these, when prophecy fails, these followers, instead of saying, oh, we were wrong about the doomsday clock, they start digging their heels and they say, oh no, we must have gotten it right. We have to figure out how to get it right, as opposed to just saying, it's a lost cause. Okay. So all of us do this to some extent. This is what's known as cognitive dissonance. We have two competing beliefs, and we have to try to reconcile those competing beliefs through some sort of made-up story, made-up narrative that we have to tell ourselves in order to justify our actions, even if our actions are irrational and have been disproven by evidence. So cognition, the way that we believe things, right? Here's a fun little example of what cognitive dissonance means, right? We feel uncomfortable when our beliefs are inconsistent. So we might have a thought, people should always be honest, right? But then we also might exaggerate or lie on our resumes. Many of us, probably all of us, walk around, with this idea like people should always be honest to us, but we know that we're not always honest with people. So yeah, there is this conflict between there's this inconsistency between what we say, how we act, and the rest of it, and we have to tell ourselves story. Now, when I lie on my resume, right, I justify it somehow. When other people lie on their resume, they're horrible people, right? When people lie to me, that's unacceptable. When I tell a little white lie to somebody, well, I'm justifying it for myself. I had a good reason to. Okay, so that's how cognitive dissonance works. Is I have to tell myself a story to make my inconsistent beliefs justified to myself. So here's a few other examples. If you think that Lance Armstrong is a hero, it's like, yeah, he raised a lot of money for cancer. That's great. He also cheated on all those races, and you're like, how do I sort of reconcile this? If you're pro-choice and you're Catholic, there's a lot of discussion right now that Joe Biden is president. He is a very devout Catholic, but he also supports a lot of pro-choice abortion policies. And, these are conversations that people have with regard to, how does a person who is a deeply devout Catholic support something that the Catholic Church is very outspoken about. And then another example would be someone who is a big animal rights person who eats meat from a factory farm, right? Which is different than just eating meat. I know a lot of animal rights people who eat meat, but they try to be very, local, grass-fed, like I know the farmers kind of thing. But people who eat it from factory farms, it's a little less humane, all right? But we try to justify all of our behaviors to ourselves when they are inconsistent with whatever our beliefs are. So you have a consonant relationship, which is when your beliefs are consistent, and a dissonant, right, cognitive dissonance, when your beliefs are inconsistent, okay? An irrelevant relationship is when your beliefs are unrelated. So this is one thing that I think is a problem in politics today. We have this sort of like Republican team, Democrat team, and very few people recognize that many of the political beliefs they have are actually beliefs that are supported by the other team, right? So it's totally fine to say something like, I want strong national security, which is more of a Republican position, and I think the minimum wage should be raised, which is more of a Democrat position, right? These two things don't have to be related to each other, but the problem with sort of modern day politics is if somebody says something like, I think the minimum wage should be raised, it's expected that you fall in line with every other Democrat proposal, right? And vice versa. If you're a person who says, I'm very pro-life, which is like a Republican platform position, and people say like, oh, you must fall in line with all Republican positions. When, this is like a small group of sort of like pro-life Democrats out there, all right? So you probably have things in common with all different types of presidential candidates. If you didn't like President Trump, my guess is if you went line item by line item with regard to what his policies were, you're going to find things that you actually liked. But most people just kind of get caught up in the character of the person and say, I want nothing to do with that party or that person. But we have to recognize that there are sort of these irrelevant relationships, and that we can support policies even if we don't vote for the candidate, right? What we usually do in politics is most of us are probably like 70-30 on supporting a party. So I might say, I'm just making stuff up now. So I just use it as examples. This has nothing to do with my personal politics. I'll try to use multiple examples here. But let's say that I 70% agree with the Republican Party, right? If I go line item by line item. But that means I'm 30% agreeing with the Democrat Party. And the way most of us vote is we can't go in there and just vote on item by item. We have to choose a candidate. So what most people do is they say, well, I'm 70% Republican, 30% Democrat. I prioritize the things that are in line with the Republican Party. I prioritize them higher, right? You could be like a one-issue voter. You could say, look, I really think the minimum wage should be raised. So even though I disagree with a lot of things the Democrats say, minimum wage is my number one issue. So I'm going to go into the voting booth. I'm going to vote for Democrats. That's how most people vote if they actually get into the details of the policies. All right, assumptions. Human beings, they desire consistency. We like consistency. All right. We don't like uncertainty. All right. So we'll talk about uncertainty reduction theory some other time. Dissonance, things that are, aren't jiving together. All right. They create psychological inconsistencies. So what we want to do is we want to try to create a narrative for ourselves. So that's a big key word for today. We create narratives, we create stories for ourselves to justify our inconsistent beliefs. So if I am pro-choice, but I am Catholic, I tell myself a story to justify it, even though outside observers are going to look at me and be like, you're a hypocrite. Those things aren't consistent. They don't align. That's irrational. All right. I have to tell myself a story. Dissonance, adverse state drives people to action with measurable effects. All right. So if there are two things that compete, I try to make them mesh. All right. By either telling myself a story or I could change one of my beliefs. We don't like being in a dissonant state, right? So it motivates us to achieve consonance, all right? So if I am pro-life and if I am pro-choice, if I'm pro-choice and I'm Catholic, I either tell myself a story, a good enough story that makes those things blend. I could say things like, well, I care more about the items of poverty, which the Catholic Church is very involved with. So I'm just going to really focus on the poverty stuff that's in the Catholic Church. I'm going to low prioritize the abortion stuff, right? Or what you could end up doing is you could say, well, if I really want to be Catholic here, I got to change from pro-life or pro-choice to pro-life. Or if you're like, no, I'm really, really committed to being pro-choice, I might have to leave the Catholic Church. All right. So dissonance does make us change with regard to how we're sort of justifying our actions. Now, the question is, will you change? Well, there's four things here: magnitude, importance, ratio, and rationale. Magnitude is how much discomfort there is. So being pro-choice and Catholic, there's probably, since abortion is a topic that's talked about often in the in the Catholic Church. It's not the main issue, but it's, it's up there. There's probably going to be a lot of discomfort. All right. So you're going to have to recognize that if there's a lot of discomfort. If it's a low priority thing, there might not be that much discomfort. How important is it, right? Is the issue important to me? So again, look, I am Catholic. Abortion might not be that big of an issue. I'm more concerned about the poor thing, right? So the importance level, all right, is going to decide whether or not I'm going to change. The ratio, is there more discomfort or comfort, right? So I'll leave it at that. You can read the rest, right? And then rationale, can I explain it away? So this gets into the storytelling, the narrative stuff, right? So, back in the day, Catholics were, going after Galileo and the rest of them with regard to some of their scientific discoveries. So rationale, can I explain it away? Can I tell you why it's okay for me to lie on my resume and it's not okay for you to lie on your resume? It's like, well, I have I used to know this person in graduate school who would put on all of his resumes master's degree, and I'm like, you're still in your master's program with me. Like, we don't have master's degrees yet. But he'd go around, he'd be looking for jobs, and he'd be like, master's degree. He's like, well, I'll have one in a year. I'm like, well, you're lying, right? If somebody lied to you on their resume, they're trying to get a job from you, you wouldn't accept it. But there was a way in which he sort of explained it away. It's like, well, I'm going to be there soon enough. I'm close to being done with my master's degree. I'll go ahead and put it on my resume, even though I'm not there yet. So there was this sort of rationality with regard to why it was okay for him to exaggerate, even though we're like exaggerating, straight up lying on your resume about the degrees that you currently hold. Okay, I like to incorporate like little case studies from important works of literature in my classes just to expose students for those who haven't had me before. And so I think this is a good book that that has a little bit of cognitive dissonance in it. So Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, if you haven't read it, you should. 1885 by Mark Twain, who I'm sure you've heard of. So the big summary of it is you have this kid, Huck Finn, and he ends up running away. I won't give away all the reasons why, but he ends up meeting this runaway slave in the process of of Huck Finn running away, and this slave's name, his name's Jim. So Huck and Jim are both kind of like runaways, right? And they're for various reasons, right? And they sort of meet up, and what's going on here is that Huckleberry Finn's notion of who black American, well, I guess they weren't legally Americans yet, who black people in the South who were currently being enslaved, who were not afforded the right to be American citizens yet for very terrible reasons. Huckleberry Finn's meeting Jim, and he's thinking through all these things. Is like everything he learned about black people was not true. All right, and he has to reconcile this. So the book is very controversial for its depictions of racism. It uses the N-word 219 times, right, which is obviously a problem if you're reading it to younger children. But done for the reason of like showing how brutal the South and slavery was. All right. So the point of the book is to draw on Huck Finn's inability to reconcile these competing ideals, right? So culture, white culture, has given him messages about who black people are and who white people are. But he becomes friends with Jim, right? Who's intelligent, compassionate, kind. Jim's trying to find his family, right? It's like, oh, Jim, you have friends, you have a family, you have people who, that you have this like loving community around you. It's like, hey, like that's what white people want too. So Huckleberry Finn's trying to sort of like recognize this and work through this. There's these moments where he has to lie to white people in positions of authority, and he's sitting there like, well, I've been told not to lie to the police, for instance, but if I tell them the truth, like they're gonna find Jim, right? And so he's having this sort of cognitive dissonance where everything that he thought was true about white people and black people, he's realizing that maybe it's not true because he meets Jim, and Jim is showing that it's not, is sort of proving that it's not true. So Huck Finn either has to tell himself a story, or he's going to have to change his beliefs about either the white people in authority who are telling us all this garbage, or Jim, who he's becoming friends with. All right. So that's this sort of like wrestling around with these two competing narratives with regard to race in the mid 1800s. Process for just collecting information. All right. Selective exposure, attention, interpretation, and retention. You need to know the difference between these. Selective exposure is, if there are things that do compete with my beliefs, I might just not watch it. I just choose not to watch it. So if you're a person who's like, you know what, I'm sure there's bad things about Donald Trump out there, I'm going to choose not to listen to it, so I'm just not going to watch MSNBC. Right? So there are people who do this, right? There are people who just say, I'm only going to watch Fox News, or I'm only going to watch MSNBC, because they don't want to hear the other side, because they don't want to hear, they don't want to hear bad information about their candidate or their political party, which is unfortunate. Selective attention, we pay attention to info that supports our current beliefs. So selective exposure means I don't even turn on the channel. Selective attention means I might turn on the channel, but I'm not listening to it, right? So you might say something effective the 2020 election, right? You know what? I did listen to the debate between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, but I really only listened to Joe Biden. Like I wasn't sort of tuned in when Bernie Sanders was talking. All right. So the TV's on, but you're not paying attention. Selective interpretation. You sort of like, yeah, you interpret the words how you'd like to hear them. So when Bernie Sanders says things like he's going to raise taxes, people might say, well, he says he's going to raise taxes, but he probably doesn't mean he's going to raise taxes on me. He probably just means other people, right? My interpretation of like Bernie Sanders, like I'm going to raise taxes, and people interpret that as like raise taxes on other people. And the short version of it is like he's going to raise taxes on everybody. All right. Selective retention is I'll listen to it, but then I'll ignore the stuff I don't like, right? I won't retain the information. I'll give you a good, fair listen, but within a few minutes, I'm just going to forget that we had this conversation. All right. So that's kind of how information process works here. Okay, minimal justification. I'm going to try to do this very clearly and concisely, so pay attention. All right. It's a little counterintuitive. All right. So Fessinger, back to our friend Fessinger, he does a study and he calls this minimal justification. So what he does is he gets people to do an extremely boring task, right? So spools of thread or turning blocks, right, on a table. He's like, I need you to do this task. He doesn't tell him it's a boring task, but he's like, I'm going to get you to do this task. So he starts to have people do this task, right? And he's recruiting someone to do the task for money, all right? And some of the people who do the task, he only gives $1 to, and other people he gives $20 to. So let's say this task is an hour long, all right? And all you have to do is there's a bunch of spools in front of you that are different colors, and it's like sort them into different piles, all right? And you get done with this hour-long task, and if Fessinger gives you $1 at the end of it, that seems like a pretty crappy salary. Because I don't want to think that I just wasted the last hour of my life, I have to tell myself a lie that this was an enjoyable task. This was kind of fun to be a part of a study with Fessinger. All right? Like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, okay, great, cool, right? I have to justify the time that I just spent doing this task. All right? Now, here's the counterintuitive part. At the end of the hour, after all this stuff, some people got $20. Those people who got $20, the justification for doing that task was the $20. So they're allowed to look at this and be like, man, this was super boring and uninteresting, and I can't believe I just wasted my time doing that. But I get satisfaction after having the $20. So minimal justification, that's the stories we tell ourselves when we are doing things that we know are nonsense, but we have to justify that nonsense to ourselves. So for instance, you sit around all day watching 4 hours of Netflix, right? You know that's a terrible idea, right? But you justify it to yourself because you might say things like, well, I need a rest day. Yesterday was really hard. I had a hard conversation with my significant other. I deserve to watch Netflix all day today, right? You don't get out of your pajamas, right? These sorts of things. So any of those days where you have like lazy days, especially if they're like every day, especially during COVID, where you don't do your homework, you don't read. You might not read for class, and your justification will be, well, we just had a test yesterday, and I worked really hard yesterday, right? It's like, yeah, but you still got to do your homework today, right? So minimal justification are the stories we tell ourselves to let us know that our time is not being wasted. If I sit here and I do if I do a very boring job with my life, right? But I'm given lots of money to do that job, the justification is in the money, right? I'll do a boring job in order to get the money. If I do a very, very boring job and I don't get paid that well, I have to justify it as, well, it's not that boring of a job. Sitting here, color coding, spools of thread or whatever, like that's not that boring, right? It's kind of interesting to be a part of some research. Ooh, this is cool and exciting. It's not cool and exciting, but we lied to ourselves, right? So minimal justification is we have to tell ourselves that our time has to be worth something, and if our time is not worth money, then we have to justify that how we're spending our time is actually fun and exciting and interesting and worthwhile, right? Binging on Netflix 5 hours a day, every day is never justified, but we tell ourselves that it is. All right. Okay. So that's minimal justification. Buyer's remorse. You probably all heard of this. This is the last slide. After our decision, we have dissonance related to the purchase. So we sit there and say, like, did I really need this, right? You probably have lots of examples of buyer's remorse for yourself. I'll tell you how you can conquer this a little bit in a second. So there are lots of studies. There's an interesting car study out there where people who, like, if I purchase a car, or I go and I say, I'm going to purchase a car. If a salesperson continues to follow up with me, hey, Josh, we talked yesterday. You think about that car? Hey, Josh, we talked a few days ago. Like, let's get that next payment going for you. When would you like this car delivered? Hey, we're going to start working on the order. What color do you want? Right? If they keep interacting with me, I am more likely to buy that car. And I sit there and I'm like, ooh, I kind of really like this car. They're talking to me a lot about it. I like the car. If I go in and I put a down payment on the car and they don't do any follow-up with me, let's say that the car is going to come to my house in a month, more people would cancel their order. Because as soon as I step out of that showroom, the sort of dopamine hit of like buying something new and fancy, it starts to wear off. So this is what's interesting about like shopping habits. Psychologically speaking, the majority of shopping that's done is not done for the item itself. People enjoy the experience of shopping, right? They enjoy the experience of getting something new and fresh and shiny, right? And you all see this with little kids at Christmas. They get the new toy at Christmas, and then a couple days later, that toy is just every other toy in their closet, not being played with all that much, right? We like the experience of new, fancy, fresh things. There's a psychological dopamine hit there, but it soon wears off, all right? So here's the little trick for you, right? And this is a practical advice thing. If people step away from the purchase before making a final decision, they think clearer about the decision, and they reduce the dissonance they have about the decision. So you think of things like, do I really need this, or is it the right choice? So here's a cool little trick you can do, especially because most of our purchases are done on like Amazon today. When you shop on Amazon, fill up your cart, and then don't purchase that thing. Give yourself like a 48-hour window before you hit send, right? So with this like one click button shopping, right, most people fill up their cart and they say, and purchase, right? If you fill up your cart and then you just wait like 48 hours, chances are you go back in and you take some of the things out of your cart. Some of the things you might need, right? Like if you do like bulk shopping for certain food items, you might say, yeah, I need those things, right? Because it's grocery shopping. But if you're just kind of like, put extra things in my cart, step away for 48 hours and chances are you're going to take a lot of stuff out of your cart. Same thing is true with like in-person shopping, brick and mortar stores. If you walk into a store once, walk into a store, look around and see all the things that you'd like to purchase, and then leave the store, right? And then if you're still thinking about that thing a day or two later, it's like, okay, go back and buy it, right? But you got to get yourself out of that situation before you purchase. You should not go, and especially for like big purchases. And by big purchases, I mean like, you know, things that are over like, you know, $100, $200. All right. Yeah. So if you want a brand new fancy coat, it's like, go to that store, look at that coat, right? Leave the store for a while. You know, leave the store for 24 hours. And if you're still thinking about it the next day, go back and purchase it. All right. But this is what buyer remorse is. And once we buy something like a brand new item, if we have remorse about it, we have dissonance about it. We're like, I shouldn't have bought, like, we have to justify it. So we say, well, I really do need a coat, right? Even though in the back of our minds, we're like, I wish I wouldn't spend that $200 on that coat. This is ridiculous, right? But so we justify it to ourselves after we make bad purchases. So a way to avoid bad purchases, step away from the purchase before you actually make the purchase, right? Okay, that's all I have for cognitive dissonance. There's another clip for today on expectancy violation. Make sure you watch that one as well. See you later.